Resistance to injustice is always there, but sometimes it happens in a very surprising way. At the end of the 19th century, the American activist Elizabeth Magie was fretting. She lived in rural Illinois, where large landowners would take your land and your home as they seemed fit. Elizabeth found this unacceptable, but how was she supposed to show it to the world? She came up with a new board game, the Landlord's Game, because everybody plays games. This game also had a message. You had to compete as a small man against the big landowners. Today, hardly anyone remembers that Elizabeth Magie had designed her game as an indictment of the landowners. Because years later, a large toy manufacturer bought the patent, and they changed the name. Now the goal was to acquire as much land as possible and crush your opponent and wipe them off the map. And we all know that game today under its new name, Monopoly. Large landowners, lack of democracy, and especially the resistance to it, bring me to South Africa. I talked to Stephanie Brito, who has been working for the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, the MST, for a long time. And I also meet Theodora Prius. She's one of the young and powerful leaders of the national network of farmers groups in Tanzania. Theodora organizes farmers in a social movement that unites around agroecology as a way out of the food crisis.
If you go to any Tanzanian household, the first thing they will welcome you with is a food. And that is when you know, aha, I've been welcomed. And it depends. So if I'm just a normal visitor that goes to there every day, to some house every day, I'll be given some certain type of food. But if they receive, for example, a guest from a far village or a far city, you get something special.
Theodora made it clear to me that food is not only a matter of the necessary calories, but also a social event. You welcome your guests with food. Food brings people together. Food, Theodora says, equals freedom.
Any Tanzanian going to the market to shop, for example, for rice, the first thing we're going to do is to smell the aroma, like, okay, I want this one, I don't want this one. So you see that opportunity of me as a consumer making choices, all those choices, and choices means freedom. We have 4 or 5 types of millet. This one, it's for the local celebration, so for making local beers, local drinks, when we have local celebration in the village. This one, I put it during dry season. This is what I'll use for making flour, to make whatever that I can make with this. This one, whenever I have a neighbor who has 1, 2, 3 issues, this is what and it's a different type of millet.
This is millet, a kind of grain. You can use it to make porridge, but also salads or dough. And there are many types of millet. Each specific occasion has a specific type of millet, but the hunger for profit jeopardizes that diversity.
Food sovereignty for us means freedom to choose. Food sovereignty for us means celebrating our cultures through food. When we eat food, that freedom of having diversity at my fingertips at home. Like I have maize, I have finger millets, I have wheat, I have cassava, I have yams, I have almost everything, which you cannot find it in the what they coin as agribusiness, because it promotes monoculture.
Monoculture means that farmers and agricultural land are used to grow the same crop on the same soil over and over again. This is detrimental to the soil because it depletes its fertility. and often such a monoculture is imposed on countries in order to speed up and increase production and thus make more profit, but also to export crops or food in exchange for hard dollars. That's how food changes from a social and cultural product to a means to make more profit. Stephanie Brito works for the Landless Workers Movement, the MST, in Brazil. And that's a huge farmers' organization that is involved in both land and food. Because in Brazil as well, agriculture suffers under the capitalist system.
It's an agricultural model that is not focused on feeding populations. It's focused on producing profit, and what that means for a lot of countries is that they are producing agricultural products for export, but not to feed their own population. So they're producing a whole host of crops that have nothing to do with fulfilling the dietary needs of their own people. And so their resources, their land, their water, their labor are being put to use to produce items for export, and meanwhile they are not producing the food to sustain themselves.
Who are these companies that can exert such a great influence on the agricultural sector? They are big companies, very big companies in fact, monopolies. There are only 4 of them and they're called ABCD after the first letter of their company name. ADM, Bunge, Cargill and Dreyfus. These 4 companies control the entire food chain, from the grain in the field to the store shelf. They and they alone control the food industry. To boost profit margins, a company like Cargill is very flexible with law and morality. In a factory in the United States, child labor was even discovered at a Cargill subsidiary last year. And the international environmental organization Mighty Earth declared Cargill the worst company in the world because of large-scale deforestation in Brazil, exploitation and unscrupulous business practices.
We're talking also about the way in which the behavior of multinational corporations creates environmental catastrophes in many countries in the global south, and we term them as environmental crimes. So when a multinational comes and pollutes a river that is the water source for an entire community, when they come and damage the underground structures and produce tremors and earthquakes in communities around the world, when they do the kind of irresponsible farming techniques that then lead to flooding and to all those kinds of things, those are all equally as important as the change of the climate. We should talk about the many ways in which the livelihoods of people are being destroyed because of the relationship that capitalism has with the environment and the way that it treats the environment as only a place from which to extract things and with no relationship with the communities and the people that live there.
Big agribusinesses that look at land as a place to get raw materials from. They don't look at the relationship between the land and the people who live here, let alone the ecological values of the land. A company like Cargill has literally divided the world into zones. Brazil is for soya, Ukraine is for grain, Ivory Coast for cocoa and so on. That is the monoculture that Theodora is talking about. Cargill decides what is produced, when and where, and then also controls the prices.
One of the ways that they've tried to control it is by controlling access to seeds. And so by being the only purveyors of seed for farmers. And so one thing that contributes to them being able to have this monopoly of seeds is for them to decrease the level of diversity that exists. And so because as long as farmers can produce their own seeds, they can have some level of autonomy and independence from these large multinationals. And so, for example, in a country like Mexico, which is where I'm from, we have a tremendous diversity of corn. Mexico is a country that the major food on which our diet depends on is corn, and for thousands and thousands of years we've had a tremendous diversity of corn, which multinationals like Monsanto have tried to attack.
Seed banks store 560,000 types of grain. Today, there are only a few seeds that dominate world trade. For thousands of years, a rich food culture has been built up, but today it is completely flattened. As a result, the freedom of food, of which Theodora speaks, is lost. Agribusinesses are also pushing up food prices. They can do that because they have a monopoly. They control the market and own huge estates. In Latin America, for example, half of all agricultural land is owned by 1% of the population. Food giants exploit small farmers, tenant farmers, and farm workers, and also deplete the land itself. The resistance of the MST, the Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra, against this devastating agricultural system is impressive. The MST fights for radical land reform, but also for ecological agriculture.
We have had to reforest large areas. A lot of areas were destroyed by a eucalyptus monoculture. We see that the agro-industry continues to deforest land.
Brazil is a very large country, and it's one of the countries in Latin America that has the largest concentration of land. So you have very few people controlling vast tracts of land. And so many of the problems of inequality and injustice in Brazil trace back to the question of land, because this kind of land concentration makes it so that people don't have access to the ability to produce their own food, and they don't have the ability to survive basically on the land. The MST was born out of that contradiction between having so much land concentrated in so few hands, which leads to an incredible amount of poverty, of hunger. The MST was born as a movement to try to give peasants access to the land that exists in the country. So to put that land to the use of satisfying the needs of Brazilians, the need for food, the need for a quality of life on the countryside.
The farmers who grow the food are starving themselves. The crops they grow destroy the land, poison the environment, and are then exported abroad. This cannot go on like this. A land reform is what is needed. There needs to be a redistribution of the land, and that reform will also ensure that the food is produced sustainably according to Stephanie, good for the environment and good for people.
There's a belief that you can't achieve food sustainability or democracy if you don't have access to land. And so the land question is fundamental. Who owns the land? The property of land is fundamental to also evolving towards a country that has a more democratic system.
Land reform and more democracy, that is what the Brazilians want, and that is a long-term struggle. In 2003, Brazilian trade unionist and metalworker Lula da Silva became the president of Brazil. And the people were hopeful.
The biggest realization, which is a huge accomplishment and cannot be undermined, is that he eliminated hunger in Brazil, which is no small thing because Brazil is a tremendously large country.
To combat urban and rural poverty, President Lula launched ambitious social programs everywhere. And one of his resolutions was that the soil resources from Brazil would serve the people in Brazil itself, and thus would no longer flow into the pockets of large foreign companies.
The PT is a party that is committed to a progressive agenda. And that progressive agenda also includes as a priority the national sovereignty of Brazil and its ability to pursue its own development path to fulfill the needs of its own people. And that is completely inconvenient to the interests, first of all, of the Brazilian bourgeoisie to a certain extent, but also to US imperialism. And Brazil is a tremendously important country in Latin America because it is the largest country, it is the largest economy, and the further Brazil moves to the left, it has a tremendous ability to influence the rest of the countries in the region, which is very threatening. And so for, I think, the Brazilian bourgeoisie, the PT government was tolerable as long as it was producing or allowing for a certain level of economic growth that was able to enrich it. But they were never going to fully trust a PT government.
In 2019, the far-right President Bolsonaro came to power. Under his rule, the rights of the indigenous peoples were curtailed, a large part of the Amazon rainforest was destroyed, and small farmers were pressured to give way to the large agricultural companies. The Brazilian establishment had prepared Bolsonaro's coup well, because the year before, Lula had been sent to prison, supposedly because of a corruption scandal, but that turned out not to be true. This year, Brazil's Supreme Court declared all his allegations null and void. But back in 2018, the damage was done. Bolsonaro's main competitor had been put behind bars.
I think that the ruling class in Brazil, allied with imperialism, was able to effect a very successful campaign to smear the PT and to malign the people of the country against it in order to weaken the left entirely.
Because Lula was on the side of the small farmers, he had the full support of the MST. They didn't let themselves be pushed around. The farmers' movement set up camp in front of the prison. And every morning they shouted, "Bom dia, Lula!" Good morning, Lula.
I stayed at awake all night. Everyone stays here to support our president. He was the best president Brazil ever had.
Thanks in part to the support and commitment of the MST and many other popular movements, Lula became president again in 2022. And that's not only important for Brazil.
The fact that Brazil has a progressive president that is committed to the development of the global South, committed to ideas of national sovereignty for peoples of the South, and to regional integration projects is tremendously important for the changing geopolitical context around the world.
The geopolitical context in the world is changing, says Stephanie, and she's right, because you see it everywhere, including at the G7 summits, for example. The G7 are the 7 richest countries in the world that behave like a kind of self-proclaimed world government. In May 2023, the G7 met in Hiroshima, Japan. And for the first time, a leader of a large emerging economy also received an invitation. That's right, Lula da Silva, president of Brazil. The self-confidence with which Lula went to that conference says a lot about a world in full change. President Lula calmly said that Brazil is a fully fledged player and that his country will no longer be under the leash of any superpower. You see, hear and feel attitudes like that more and more often. Countries in the South are looking for an alternative to US dominance. They want to determine their own future. They want to grow food for their own people. They want to exploit their own soil resources, but they also want to process them. They want to establish South-South relations. Because Stephanie says this system no longer works.
Capitalism is in a crisis, as we all know, and it is no longer able to produce the kind of growth and profit that it was in a different time. And we believe that capitalism is in a structural and terminal crisis. That doesn't mean that capitalism is going to get to some point where it's going to naturally cease to exist. No. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that it is in a situation where conditions are getting worse and worse and worse every day, and there's no solution in sight to solve the kind of internal problems of the capitalist system. Now, what that creates for the Global South is that countries of the Global South are increasingly hampered by the kind of structure that capitalism has created, and so governments like the government of South Africa are not able to fulfill the material needs of their people under this current structure. So you see, like right now, we're in Johannesburg. Johannesburg is going through a tremendous water crisis where people are going for days and days without having any access to water in their homes. They're having a tremendous problem of energy shortages.
More and more countries in the South want to chart a new course, a course of their own in which they can build their own economy, be sovereign, be free, be non-aligned. But that's not easy, because the world relations are skewed, and even if you are sovereign, remaining economically dependent on the skewed world relations will not get you very far. Progressive governments need pressure from below to support them, but also to keep them in line. And that is certainly important in Brazil, says Stephanie.
I think that we should be very happy and elated about the victory of the PT in the recent elections, but we should be cautiously optimistic because all of these progressive governments, they have to sit on top of a very strong structure of organized people that are ready to mobilize and to push and maintain the agenda of the government in the left. And that's one. And two, that are able to defend those governments from all kinds of imperialist plots and bourgeois plots to take them out. Every progressive government we've had in Latin America has had to defend itself from being taken out based on interventions of US imperialism. So we're happy, but we have to always be on guard that our governments need to be defended. They have to be defended, and they have to be always be pushed further to the left. They're not going to perform any miracles if people are not organized.
Those movements from below remain independent movements, autonomous movements. Whether it's metal workers here in South Africa or the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil. They have their own power of mobilization and also their own vision of society. They're trying to push their government to the left, and they want to prevent foreign forces from regaining control of domestic wealth.
That's the kind of contradiction and tension that all progressive movements in Latin America find ourselves in, that we have to, on the one hand, push our progressive government to the left. We can't just basically approve and support every single policy that they take on for the purpose of maintaining the unity and the alliance. We have to push them to the left because there's a variety of things that they will not do if they are not pushed, but we also have to defend them. Because if we don't defend them, they will suffer the attacks from the right that we've seen happen in all our countries in the region.
Grace Blakely in the United Kingdom and Sevim Dagdalan in Berlin told me how more and more people can't afford a daily healthy meal. It's the same monopolies that exploit the land in the south that cause high food prices in the north. Here in South Africa, I'm a guest at an international conference, Dilemmas of Humanity. This is where the South gets a face. Just like the striking nurses in London have given a face to the mutiny in the North. And those movements in the North and the South are interconnected on a human, political, and economic level. That connection strikes me more than ever, and it's important.
If we are able to link what is happening here in the IPA, what is happening in Brazil, what is happening in South Africa, what is happening in India, with what is happening in the summer of discontent, with what is happening in Europe and in the United States, if we can link together, we are very strong, comrades. The working class is an international class. We are an international movement. We will win only when we stay internationally, comrades. Thank you very much.
From our view, that is not a situation, that is given. All of that crisis, it's not going to magically breed some kind of more humane, democratic, and egalitarian society. You have to have people organized to take those contradictions that they're dealing with and transform them into a progressive agenda. And we believe that for countries to do that, they will not be able to do them just in their own countries. It's going to require solidarity between countries, because as soon as one country develops a progressive government, they become isolated. And so as long as we're not developing many progressive governments at the same time that are able to play solidarity with each other, we're not going to be able to advance.
You're fine.
Oh, good. How are you?
Fine.
Oh, from which country?
Belgium, Workers' Party of Belgium.
Workers' Party of Belgium.
Yeah.
The conference in Johannesburg is interesting, and it's a privilege to be here and to be able to see and hear the world from the other side. That also brings with it a responsibility. We do not have the luxury of setting up the social movements in the North against those in the South or vice versa. No, we have a responsibility to link these two movements, because it's the same struggle in the North and the South.
Because at the end of the day, we live in the exact same planet, and our future is interlinked. Our future is the working class. The bourgeoisie may build bunkers, they may go to Mars, but we're staying here, all of us. Whether you're a worker in Belgium, or you're a worker in Johannesburg, or you're a worker in Argentina, we are going to have to build a different world together.
I'll be happy to meet you and understand what is happening in Belgium. maybe we can learn one or two things from you. You can also learn one or two things from us. Yeah, because we must interact from time to time. Maybe we must visit Belgium as well. See what is happening on the ground.
One of the central speakers here at the conference is Vijay Prashad, the Indian historian. And I've known him for a long time, but I'm once again very impressed. Why is mutiny in the north and mutiny in the south so strongly linked? I talked to Vijay about that in the next and final episode.